So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We are going to start. Welcome, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our sessions, continuing professional development session for today from the University of Technology and Applied Sciences, Rustaq College of Education. We welcome Dr. Ali Almanna, who is the series editor of Routledge Studies in Arabic Translation, London, New York, and Routledge. He obtained his PhD in Translation Studies from the University of Durham, UK, and his MA in Translation Studies from Westminster University. Currently, he is an associate professor of Translation Studies at Hamad bin Khalifa University, College of Humanities and Social Sciences, where he teaches and supervises MA and PhD students. In addition to many articles published in peer-reviewed journals, he is author, editor, and translator of several publications. His recent publications include the Routledge Course in Translation Annotation, London, New York, Routledge 2016, Semantics for Translation Students, Oxford, Peter Land 2016, The Nuts and Bolts of Arabic-English Translation, Newcastle upon Tyne, Cambridge Scholars Publishing 2018, The Arabic-English Translator at Photographer, London, New York, Routledge 2019, Reframing Realities Through Translation, Oxford, Peter Land 2020, and Translation as a set of frames, London, New York, Routledge. Thank you very much, Dr. Ali, for accepting our invitation to be our guest today, inshallah. And thank you, Dr. Nagam, for just allowing us to get Dr. Ali here with us. So the honor is ours, and inshallah, we are going to gain a lot from you, not only for this time, and inshallah, in future time. The floor is yours, Dr. Ali. If you wish the session to be interactive, it's you. If you wish to save the questions up to the end, again, it's you. So thank you very much indeed, and welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Yaqub. First, good afternoon. Hope that you are doing well and everything is good at your end. Thanks for giving me this opportunity to talk about my own project titled A Cognitive Narrative Theory of Translation. But today I will be talking about translation as re-narration, translation as an act of re-narrating, and the translator as re-narrator. And before starting, before we give it a go, before setting the wheels in motion, let me seize this opportunity to thank Dr. Yaqub and Dr. Nagam Al-Azzawi for inviting me to touch on some of my ideas in the field of translation studies. Also, let me thank you all, my dear colleagues, friends, and students, for attending this webinar, for making this possible, for making this a reality. Now, let's make a start. In this webinar, I'm going to talk about translation as re-narration. I'm going to talk about the translation as an act of re-narrating, and the translator as re-narrator, by raising a number of questions and trying to provide you with full and precise answers instead of the dusty answers that you might have right now. So the questions that I would like to share with you right now are: can we get away from narratives? Can we stop discoursing on narratives? What is a narrative as a concrete concept, as a product? What is a narrative as an abstract notion? What are the main types of narratives? And what are the main features of the narrative as an abstract notion. What are the main features of the narrative with a capital N? Because later I'm going to discuss that with you, that we have two types of narratives. A narrative as a concrete concept and a narrative as an abstract notion. What are the main sources of narratives? What is narrativity? Or what is the difference between a narrative and narrativity? What are the main features of narrativity? Or what are the main types of narrativity? And what is the significance of this theory, the narrative theory? What are the main limitations of this theory? So let's get started. Let me start with the first question. Can we get away from narratives? Can we stop discoursing on narratives? Actually, no. Narratives are everywhere. So the picture that you see is a narrative. The sound that you hear is a narrative. The voice that you hear is a narrative. The advertisement that you read, that you see is a narrative. The reaction that you observe is a narrative. The text that you read is a narrative. So narratives are everywhere, and we cannot get away from narratives. We need narratives to understand ourselves and to understand others when we talk about self and other. When we divide the world into self and other, we need narratives to communicate with others. We need narratives to make sense of the world around us. So through narratives, people understand themselves. Through narratives, people can produce, reproduce, or even shape their own personal knowledge and experiences. They can construct their own identities, their own social identities. So it seems that we can stop discoursing on narratives. Narratives are everywhere. They can be written, they can be verbal, they can be physical when we concentrate on the reaction of somebody. So the reaction of somebody living in that country, belonging to a particular community, might be slightly or completely different from the reaction of somebody else. So why do we act differently? Why do we react differently? Why do we behave differently? Actually, because those narratives, because of those stories that we tell, because of those narratives that we subscribe to, because of those narratives that we develop over time, because of those narratives that we have a sense of belonging to, that we believe in, that we support. Now, what is a narrative? Actually, following many scholars such as Somers and Gibson 1994, Somers 2000, Denson 2000, Baker 2006, among others, a narrative can be defined as a story of a set of events ordered in sequence, and each narrative should have three main parts: an initial part, a middle part, and an end. And those three main parts should be linked both logically and coherently. Otherwise, it is difficult to make sense of those events selected by you, those events ordered by you. So here, according to that definition, they talk about stories that we believe in. They talk about stories that we subscribe to, that we have a sense of belonging to, that we support, that we develop over time. So the story that you tell your mom about what happened to you, let's say a month ago, is a narrative. The story that you tell your dad about what you saw 2 days ago is a narrative. The story that you tell your teacher about what happened to your friend is a narrative. But a narrative for me can be looked from two different perspectives. As a concrete concept, as a concrete notion, as a product, a narrative with a small n can be defined following many scholars we have already mentioned there, such as Somers and Gibson 1994, Somers 2000, Denson 2000, Baker 2006, among others. Concrete notion as a product can be defined as a story of a set of events ordered in sequence, whether spatially or temporally. But a narrative as an abstract notion, a narrative with a capital N, for me, can be defined as unspoken social motivation, unspoken social pressure, unspoken social force, shared collectively by a group of people belonging to a particular community. This is my own definition in my own forthcoming project titled A Cogno-Narrative Theory of Translation. Now let's move to talk about the relationship between a narrative with a small n and a narrative with a capital N. Let's talk about the relationship between a narrative as a concrete concept, as a product, and a narrative as an abstract notion. So, what is the relationship between them? Actually, the relationship between them is not dynamically neutral. It is not neutral, but rather it is characterized by having a force dynamic value of forcing you as a social agent belonging to a particular community, sharing certain values, having a culture to act, react, or behave in that way. So a narrative with a capital N, a narrative as an abstract notion, is characterized first by normativity, telling you what is good and what is bad, telling you what is correct and what is not, telling you what is appropriate and what is not. Second, it is shared collectively by a group of people belonging to a particular community. And finally, it is influenced by the master discourse at a particular period. Now, having defined the narrative as a concrete concept, a narrative as an abstract notion, and we talked about the relationship between them. Now let's move to talk about the types of narratives. Actually, we have four types of narratives, namely ontological narratives, also known as personal narratives. There are personal narratives, personal stories that we use to make sense of what is going on around us, to understand ourselves, to understand others, to construct our social identities, to produce, reproduce, or even shape our personal knowledge. So they are stories that we tell on daily basis. They are related to us, they are attached to us. The second type of narratives is called a public narrative. When we talk about those narratives, those stories attached to groups larger than individuals. So when we talk about electricity in Iraq, we have a public narrative attached to all Iraqis. When we talk about Shaheen and what happened in Oman 2 weeks ago, we have a public narrative attached to all those people living and Oman, and so on and so forth. And the third type is called a conceptual narrative. And a good example of this type of narratives is our webinar tonight. So it is a conceptual story. It is a conceptual narrative. So it is attached to all those people who are interested in this topic. So when we talk about conceptual narratives, we talk about those narratives used by people as social researchers and attached to any field of study. And the last type of narratives is called meta-narrative, also known as a master narrative, attached to all people all over the world. And a good example that can be considered here is COVID-19, coronavirus, or war on terror. So these are the main types of narratives. Okay? And to produce any narrative, to produce or to tell any story with a small n, as a concrete concept, as a product, we normally rely on 4 main sources, namely reality, imagination, memory, and sources. When we attribute the attributed material to somebody, and we either acknowledge it, endorse it, or distance ourselves from it. But it is worth mentioning that people tend to use a combination of 2 sources, or maybe more than 2 sources. So they start their own story, their own narrative, with something taken from the reality, and all of a sudden they inject it with something from their own imagination. Sometimes for a good reason, but sometimes for a bad reason. But sometimes no. They start their own narrative, their own story, with something taken from their own imagination, and then they move to rely on the reality or sources. Again, sometimes for a good reason, to protect somebody, in order not to put somebody in an embarrassing situation, in order not to put yourself in an embarrassing situation, but sometimes no, for a bad reason. So now, let's move to talk about narrativity. So now, what is narrativity then? We have already mentioned and we have already talked about narratives. We have already talked about the types of narratives and the sources of narratives. But the question that might be raised here, what is narrativity? And what is the difference between a narrative and narrativity? Are they synonyms? Actually, narrativity for me is directionality. So when you superimpose certain directionality, certain narrativity on the text at hand, when we talk about translators, so we talk about narrativity. So narrativity is a process rather than a product, while a narrative as a concrete concept, as a product, is a product. So narrativity for me is directionality. So when you superimpose certain directionality on the text at hand, as a translator, as a language user, as a writer, as a speaker, this is what? This is narrativity. So narrativity is directionality, narrativity is the process, and it can be translated into Arabic as a salt, while a narrative can be translated into hikaya, because it is a product. In particular, when we concentrate on a narrative with a small n, a narrative as a concrete concept. And what are the main features of narrativity? Actually, there are many features, but I'm going to concentrate on 4. First, if you remember the definition of a narrative as a concrete concept, just to remind you, a narrative as a concrete concept, according to Summers and Gibson 1994, can be defined as a story of a set of events ordered in sequence. So it seems that you need to select those events and then you order them. So this is the first feature, which is called selectivity. You have a lot of events, you want to tell a story, you want to produce a narrative, and then you have to select your own materials. You have to select your own events. Of course, you have to exclude others. So this is the first feature, which is called selectivity. And then you have to order them, both spatially and temporally. And this is the second feature, which is called diachronicity. And then you have to inject your own story with a theme. And this is the second feature, which is called employment, when you have a plot. And the fourth one, and the fourth feature, I call it dependency, because the interpretation of that event relies on the interpretation of others. So these are the main features of narrativity. We have 4 features. Now, what are the main types of narrativity? For me, in my own project, we have 2 main types. Narrativity by external framing and narrativity by internal framing. And narrativity by external framing can be divided into 2 main types. Narrativity by external framing on purpose, when you are motivated by your own ideology, when you are motivated by your own accumulated value system, when you are motivated by your own assumptions, commitments, when you are motivated by your own sense of belonging, thus superimposing certain directionality, remember, certain narrativity on the text at hand, on your own product, on your own narrative, thus having it meet your own ideology, your own accumulated value system, your own assumptions, commitments, and sense of belonging. So this is on purpose. But sometimes no, it is not on purpose. Sometimes you are not motivated by your own ideology. You are not motivated by your own accumulated value system, but rather it is by mistake, due to your own translation competence, due to your own linguistic competence, which is part of your own translation competence. Actually, it is the most important part of your own translation competence. So when you fail to understand the source text, you might encode it in that way, thus superimposing certain directionality on the text at hand. So you see, let me summarize. So narrativity can be divided into 2 main types, and this is my own classification, by the way. This is my own classification, by the way, in my own forthcoming project titled A Cogno-Narrative Theory. So they can be classified into narrativity, directionality, just to remind you, by internal framing. When you take into consideration the differences between the 2 languages, when you take into consideration the differences between the 2 cultures, when you try to live up to the target language reader's expectations. So this is narrativity by internal framing, which is something recommended. We normally encourage our students to take into consideration the differences between the 2 languages, the source language and the target language. We encourage them to take into consideration the differences between the source culture and the target culture. We encourage them to live up to the target language reader's expectations. This is the first type of narrativity, which is I call narrativity by internal framing. And the second type I call narrativity by external framing. It could be on purpose, when you are motivated by your own ideology, when you are motivated by your own accumulated value system, when you are motivated by your own sense of belonging. Thus changing, for example, the state of Israel into Al-Kayan al-Sahyani. So here we have an example of narrativity by external framing. On purpose, you are motivated as a translator by your own ideology, by your own accumulated value system, by your own sense of belonging. But sometimes no. As a translator, you fail to be an insider in the source culture in order to understand. Or you fail to adopt the outsider perspective in order to encode what you have already understood, thus failing to translate accurately, thus failing to create a similar mental image in the mind of the target language reader. So this is icons by mistake. Why? Because you are not motivated by your own ideology. You are not motivated by your own accumulated value system. You are not motivated by your own sense of belonging. But this is due to your own translation competence, or this is due to your own linguistic competence, which is part of translation competence. And it is worth mentioning that the first type, which I call narrativity by internal framing, is recommended. We encourage you, we encourage our students, we encourage our colleagues to take into consideration the differences between the source language and the target language. We encourage them to take into consideration the differences between the source culture and the target culture. We encourage them to live up to the target language reader's expectations. So it is something recommended. So the text that you receive for the purpose of translation is seen in this project as a narrative, as a story, as a product. And that narrative is made up of a number of events. And each event is made up of a number of processes, such as a process of doing, a process of having, a process of existing, a process of sensing, a process of saying, a process of being, to borrow terms from Holiday. And each process is made up of three main components. The process itself, typically expressed by verbs, such as to read, to sit, to stand, to dance, to sing, to talk, to explain, and so on and so forth. Participants, typically expressed by noun phrases, and circumstances, typically expressed by adverbs, such as an adverb of time, an adverb of place, an adverb of manner, and so on and so forth. But the question that might be raised here, the question that might rear its ugly head here, what will happen to your own story? What will happen to your own product if you add an event due to your own ideology? If you exclude an event due to your own sense of belonging? What will happen to the narrative? What will happen to the story if you change a process into a circumstance, or if you change a circumstance into a process? What will happen to that narrative if you change a process of doing into a process of having, a process of existing into a process of saying, and so on and so forth? What will happen to the narrative if you don't pay attention to the characteristics of the matter, typically expressed by the noun phrase? So what will happen to the narrative what will happen to your own story if you don't pay attention to the characteristics of the action, typically expressed by verbs. If you don't pay attention to the grammatical categories of the verb, if you change your tense, if you change aspect, if you change a non-evaluative sentence into an evaluative one. So what will happen to your own narrative? What will happen to your own story if you don't pay attention to all these details? This is my own project in a nutshell. I have already defined the term narrative from two different perspectives. A narrative as a product, a narrative as a concrete concept can be defined as a story of a set of events, but a narrative as an abstract notion with a capital N can be defined as a unspoken social motivation that motivates you to act, react, or behave in that way. And also we discussed the relationship between the narrative as a concrete concept and the narrative as an abstract notion. We said that relationship between them is not dynamically neutral, but rather it is characterized by having a force dynamic value of forcing you as a social agent to act, react, or behave in that way. To force you as a translator to add, to delete, to change a process. Why? Because you are motivated by your own ideology. And also we talked about narrativity, and we defined the term narrativity. Narrativity is the directionality. It is a process. It can be translated into third, while a narrative as a concrete concept, as a product, can be translated into Arabic as hikaya. So now let's have some examples to make what I have in my mind clear. We have a sentence here. قالت وهي ترمق سوارا ذهبيا في معصمها سأدفع لك ما تريد. أو repeat. قالت وهي ترمق سوارا ذهبيا في معصمها سأدفع لك ما تريد. Here in this sentence we have four processes. قالت, so we have a process of saying. We have a verbal process. وهي ترمق, we have a process of sensing. We have a mental process expressed by the verb ترمق. سأدفع لك, we have a process of doing expressed by the verb أدفع. And the fourth one, ما تريد, it is a process of sensing again expressed by the verb تريد. That sentence, was translated by Ronak Husni and Daniel Newman into staring at the gold bracelet on her wrist. So they started with the process of sensing. They start their own translation with an infinite clause, staring at. She said, followed by a process of saying, expressed by the verb to say in the past. I will pay you. I will pay you. Process of doing what you want. Process of sensing. So it seems that they have managed to translate all those four processes. They have taken into consideration the differences between the two languages. Therefore, they started with a process of sensing, but without changing the meaning, without changing the mental image conjured up in our mind. So this is an example of narrativity by internal framing. It is something recommended. So when we translate from Arabic into English or the other way around, sometimes we reorder the parts of the sentence. Sometimes we delete. Sometimes we add. but we are not motivated by our ideologies. No. This is because we have taken into consideration the differences between the two languages. Sometimes also we have to take into consideration the differences between the two cultures. So this is something recommended, which is called narrativity, because again, you superimpose certain directionality on the text at hand, but just to live up to the target language reader's expectations, to take into consideration the differences between the two languages. Now let's move to discuss the second type. I will read from the same source. عاد من جديد يسترق النظر إليها. I will repeat. عاد من جديد يسترق النظر إليها عله يجد شيئا في ملامحها. Let's concentrate on عله. I will repeat. عله يجد شيئا. عاد من جديد يسترق النظر إليها عله يجد شيئا في ملامحها. Here, by virtue of عله, it is not asserted that he found something in her features. It is not asserted, we are not sure that he found something in her features. Therefore, we have technical terms here. Therefore, the scope of intention, مديات النية, is greater than the extent of causation, تحقق الفعل. So, let me repeat. By virtue of عله, it is not asserted, we are not sure that he found something in her features. He tried to find. Maybe he succeeds, maybe not. Therefore, the scope of intention, مديات النية, is greater than the extent of causation, تحقق الفعل. But the translators, Rustaq Husni and Daniel Newman, unfortunately decided to use the additive connector. Let me read their own translation. Once again, he glanced over at her and noticed something in her features. And noticed something in her features. Here, by virtue of the additive connector and, it is asserted that he found. It is part of reality, while in the source text it is part of a reality. Therefore, the extent of causation in the target text by virtue of and is greater than the scope of intention. So here we have an example of narrativity by external framing. But I'm sure they are not motivated by their own ideology. They are not motivated by their own accumulated value system or sense of belonging. But this is due to their own translation competence. It seems that they didn't pay attention to Allahu, and that's why they decided to put it in that way. In other words, they decided to superimpose by accident certain directionality, certain narrativity on the text at hand, on the narrative, on the story. Let's move to have the last example. Here I have an example taken from BBC. I will not read the whole text. It is a sentence, it is a clause. So Israeli police say. So it is a process of saying in the present. Okay, now we have two translators. The first translator translated the verb to say into ذكرت شرطة الاحتلال الإسرائيلي. So the translator here, motivated by her ideology, by her accumulated value system, decided to superimpose certain directionality, certain narrativity on the text at hand by adding the word احتلال. And the second translator translated the same clause صرحت شرطة الكيان الصهيوني. Again, for the same reason. The translator, okay, was motivated by her ideology, decided to add the word al-kayan. So here we have an example of narrativity by external framing, but on purpose. So when you are motivated as a translator by your own ideology, by your own accumulated value system, assumptions, commitment, sense of belonging, we are going to have an example of narrativity by external framing on purpose. So this is how to distinguish between narrative as a concrete concept, as a story, as a product, and narrativity as directionality, when you superimpose certain directionality on the text at hand, thus having met your own either linguistic competence, which is part of a translation competence, or no, to have it meet your own ideology. So we have two types of narrativity. This is according to me, narrativity by internal framing, which is something recommended, and narrativity by external framing, and can be classified into on purpose or by accident. Thanks for listening. Back to you, Dr. Yaqub.
Thank you very much indeed, Doctor. It's really interesting and it's very enjoyable, talk, though I'm not specialized in that, but I really enjoyed it a lot. Thank you very much. This is very informative. Now, if anyone from the audience wants to just ask question or just post further in a comment, you are most welcome. Before we just call the meeting, Dr. Anagam, go ahead, please.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much, Doctor, for such informative webinar. And thank you very much for abiding by time. This is really important these days. And my question now, the last point that you have mentioned regarding internal and external framing. Now, do I understand that internal framing would rather go towards conceptuality? That is to say, it would be like more fiddle to the translation rather than external framing, which would be affected by personal ideologies?
Thank you.
Can I conclude like that?
Yeah, please. May I answer?
Yes, please.
Yeah, because if you remember, Dr. Nagam, thanks for the good question. If you remember, we said when we talked about narrativity by external framing, also we have two types. Sometimes you are motivated by your own ideology. You cannot translate Dawlat Israel in that way, therefore you change it into Al-Kayan al-Sahiyoni. This is an example of narrativity by external framing on purpose. But sometimes, no, we have another type which is called narrativity by against external framing by accident due to your own linguistic competence or translation competence. You have done your best and you have analyzed the text and you failed to be an insider in the source culture, and this is your own understanding, therefore you put it in that way. Again, you have superimposed certain directionality on the text at hand. Your own translation is not accurate, and the relationship between the source text and the target text is not strong. But when we talk about narrativity by internal framing, this is when you try to live up to the target language reader's expectations. Of course, it depends on the translation brief. When we translate, the first step that we have to do is that we reflect on what is called translation brief. We need to identify the text type, the genre, the purpose of translation, the readership, and then we decide either we go for a reader-oriented translation or no, text author oriented translation. Sometimes you go something in between. So when you try to take into consideration the differences between the two languages, and then you haven't changed that meaning. In other words, this is a key word. You haven't manipulated the text ideologically. or by mistake. This is what something recommended. We encourage people. Sometimes there is no need to translate. For example, وهمس في أذنها. Can we delete في أذنها? It depends on your own global strategy. If it is read-oriented, yes, please delete, because the act of whispering implies that you come close to somebody. So sometimes we encourage people to delete, to add, to reorder, but you need to justify that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Thank you. It's a struggle, isn't it, to translate?
Yeah, that's true. It is not. It is a complicated process. Yeah. And by the way, because one day I was asked about Google Translate. What about Google Translate? Can we consider in this project, my own project, that classification when we classify narrative? Yes, we can. We can discuss it when we talk about narrativity by external framing, by accident, if it is not accurate, due to.
By the way, Doctor, I'm not at all against Google Translation. In fact, I find it feasible, especially within certain text, within certain genre.
That's true.
Yeah.
We rely on Google Translate and other softwares these days, and we encourage our students to rely on them, but they have to add, they have to edit.
Yeah. Cat tools. Yeah. Thank you very much, Doctor.
Thank you, Dr. Naam. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Nagam. Dr. Sharifa, but she's only thanking us. Do we have other question before we finish the talk? Yeah, I've got a question here by Sultan. Mr. Sultan said, I have a general question, was disappeared. Will mechanics be able to translate as effectively as human one day? I mean, machines here. Will machines?
Yeah, these days, yes. Yes, these days, I mean, when you translate by yourself, sometimes you said, let me use, let's say, Google Translate, and you will be surprised. They will give you a lot of options. But you cannot rely on 100%. You have to interfere here and there. You add a connector, because you are a native speaker. If you translate into Arabic, you are a native speaker of Arabic, and you have to take into consideration the differences between English and Arabic. We normally add connectors when we translate into Arabic. We add wa, fa, etc. Sometimes no. I mean, when we talk about machine translations, they fail to distinguish between qiyam and qayyama. They fail to distinguish between sibaq and sabbaq. So you have to be careful. Yeah.
Dr. Holly, do you have a question you want to ask? I guess because this is one of your areas.
Yeah, just thank you very much, Dr. Ali, for the insightful and informative session. Just my question is just rather a general question. Do you think that the field of translations is just being like, I would say, came to an end? Because we feel that there hasn't been new trends in translation theories and I would say, and like discourse in general, other fields. Do you think so, or?
No, I don't think so. Thank you, Dr. Holly, for this a good question. To be honest with you, we can reflect on that. Actually, I think no. Why? Because we have a lot of theories. Now I'm working on a theory which is called a cogno-narrative theory of translation. I've been working on that theory, but I will not submit that theory to any publisher without publishing some articles and presenting my own ideas to other people in order to have feedback. So in this theory, I'm trying to have tried to combine the narrative theory proposed by Summers and Gibson, the imaging systems proposed by Talmi, and also I have already published a book with my colleague, Dr. Khalid Shihari of Qatar University, titled The Arabic English Translator as Photographer. We looked at translation as a process of picture taking. So, and in addition to that, also ideas from holiday. When I talked about transitivity, process of doing, process of having, etc. Added to that also, these days I'm working on what is called appraisal theory or appraisal framework proposed by Martin and White. When we try to concentrate on the attitude, when we try to translate your own feeling. When you said, for example, she's a girl, this is a non-evaluative sentence. As a translator, because you feel it is good to add the word, let me insert the word instead of saying she's a girl, and you say she's a good girl. By doing so, by inserting that adjective, that evaluative word, you are going to change the attitude of the speaker, the attitude of the. So you see, we try to rely on other fields in order to have our own theories, and we will carry on, by the way. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed again, Dr. Ali, and our participants here, our audience, very much. So inshallah we will meet again, and hopefully inshallah very soon. Thank you very much indeed for accepting our invitation, Dr. Ali. Very, you have made our day. Thank you. Very enriching, talk.
Thanks a lot.
So take care, and we'll keep in touch, inshallah ta'ala.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Yes, thank you.